honorable speakers here, Mr. Wagmar and Dr. Stott. First of all, I would like to begin the session by remembering the victims of this heinous crime, their friends and their families, and how we should remember the Indian law enforcement agencies, who laid down their lives, protecting the freedom and the democratic values which we have. 12 years have passed, so there's quite a lot of change which has happened both, politically and in the geopolitical context throughout the globe. I would first like to probably hear a little bit on the initial thoughts of Dr. Wagmar, and then I'll come to Dr. Scott. So I give the floor to Mr. Wagmar to start his opening conversations, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Bridge India, and thank you, Mr. Dev Sarkar, for organizing this through the good offices of Mr. Dattani. I hope I'm audible. First things first, insofar as foregrounding my remarks on Bombay 2611 go, it should be straightaway dovetailing in on the Lashkar-e-Tayyiba and Hafiz Mohammed Said, the organization's chair, and some remarks of Hafiz Mohammed Said in question. A Punjabi Muhajir from East Punjab, hailing from just before partition days, and that has scarred him for life with an abiding animus against India. Please remember that Pakistanis, Punjabis, who are Pakistani Punjabi Muhajirs at that, from East Punjab, constitute the most volatile, the most hardline elements in Pakistan's intelligence services, civil service, politics, and the armed forces, because of what they remember as the trauma of partition. And Hafiz Mohammed Said does hail from East Punjab in what was India and is now India. That needs to be pointed out. And his animus, what drives him and the Lashkar against India, is not India per se conceptually, as much as an abiding hatred of Hindus, who for him are conflated with India. That needs to be put in context too, for Pakistanis like Hafiz Mohammed Said. So how does this man come on the scene? Well, Zia-ul Haq brought him on board after the coup of 1977 by having him on the Ideological Council of Pakistan, which was instituted by Zia. In the intervening years, Hafiz Mohammed Said was off in Saudi Arabia teaching and also learning, and which is how you know from his title Hafiz as someone who knows the Quran by heart. So he's something of an itinerant preacher as well as a teacher, a theologian, though not exactly qualified in the fullest sense of the latter term. He comes on the scene, in the South Asian scene, after the October 1989 insurgency, which began in Kashmir. And the Lashkar-e-Tayyiba went about, or rather was put to task by the Pakistani deep state in order to combat this and make India bleed, as they say in Pakistan intelligence speak, when the Lashkar took to it from 1993. And please note, from 1993 to Bombay 2611, 2008, the Lashkar was pretty much focused on India, and that too just Kashmir. That was its so-called raison d'etre. And that was what it was instructed to do, for which it was instructed in more ways than one. Lashkar Fedayeen suicide terror cells were trained by Pakistani intelligence and army operatives at Pakistani camps across the countryside. They have their own institute just 30 kilometers from Lahore in the town of Muridke, which constitutes the LET's headquarters under Hafiz Mohammed Said. And they have a considerable income at their disposal through farms, factories, and the like. So it is a self-sufficient unit, but it still enjoys the sanctuary and the material and largesse of the Pakistani deep state. The military head of the LET, Zakir Rahman Lakhvi, who is the brainchild of Bombay 2611, is a close associate of Lieutenant General Shuja Pasha, who was, at the time of the attacks, the Director General of the ISI, Pakistan's external intelligence services. So that connection is important to bear in mind, despite what the LET may state or what the ISI may give us to understand, much less the Pakistan Foreign Office or any other public spokespersons from Pakistan on the entire incident. It also, that leads us to the question of Dawood Coleman Gilani, the man responsible for reconnaissance of what occurred in Bombay and his multiple visits to India, particularly Bombay, befriending one and all, leading to what happened. He was the target man on site, reconnoitering sites across Bombay, which include, of course, the Taj Mahal Hotel, the Oberoi Towers, Victoria Terminus Station, and of course, as we now know, what was originally in the list but eventually dropped was Bombay's Sahar Airport Terminal 2, the international terminal. That was meant to be on the hit list too, but for some reason it was dropped and the Oberoi Towers was added on to as a replacement. Not to mention the Carmine Allbliss Hospital, a charity lying in hospital, and the Leopold Cafe, which was also attacked, as we do know. To say nothing of bystanders across downtown Bombay who were shot dead too, or wounded. And last but by no means the least, the Lubavitch Chabad House of Jewish visitors to Bombay, Hasidic Jews, who have their center in South Bombay, which of course was brutally targeted, and the killing of one and all within the precincts. And that was what led to the final hours of the hostage taking. It's interesting to note when we talk about hostage taking that it just took 10 Sunni boys, 10 Sunni Pakistani males, barely out of their teens, to bring a city of some 22 million odd into complete lockdown for about a good 70 odd hours. This is South and Southeast Asia's largest metropolis. And it only took 10 men to do that. It just took two brothers to do that at the time of the Boston Marathon rally too. It took about a clutch of 4 to 5 men recently in Vienna. So for those who point out that these are just lone wolf attacks and tend to belittle them, it is interesting to remind them that it just takes about 1 or 2 at the most to bring an entire city into lockdown. And we've seen that in parts of London too when we've had our attacks, which Dr. Stott will attend to subsequently. And let me just close my opening remarks with this. What ensued in Bombay would have not been brought to light, but for the fact that one accomplice, Ajmal Kasab, was arrested and confessed, and a due trial was held, subsequent to which he was executed in India. The point is this: we would have not known any of this but for the fact that Mr. Kasab was arrested and proved to be a Pakistani. Barely 24 hours after he confessed and upon being arrested, Pakistani intelligence agents swooped down into Okara district of Punjab to abscond his parents and threatened villagers, their neighbors, that they oughtn't speak to the world press should it descend on the town in question, which of course they did. And as we know, the Dawn's reporter, Pakistan's leading English language daily, was the first to break it to us, despite Pakistan's denials through the intervening hours of the crisis that it had no play in any of this. And despite putting out the fact and sending out wrong feelers, fake news as we call it now, that this was led by a so-called Deccan Mujahideen group. Now, this phantom group was never heard of before and has never been heard of since. And we do now know that there was no such Deccan Mujahideen, but these were 10 Pakistanis trained by the LET and dispatched by the Pakistani deep state. And we would have not known any of this but for the fact that Dawood Gilani, the man reconnaissing Bombay, was arrested subsequently by the FBI, and the trial which took place with Tahawur Rana in Chicago in 2009 onwards led us to know what really ensued. Gilani has served some time also as a double CIA agent. It must be pointed out that he was on secondment. He was loaned by the LET to also go and make a reconnaissance of Denmark, which led to the 2009 attacks at the said Danish newspaper following the Mohammed cartoons incident. And that brings us to the point of what I stated earlier, that the LET has gone international. It is not regionally focused with a particular grievance against Hindus or Kashmiris or India. And finally, let me just mention this, that the attacks took place in November 2008, Wednesday, a day before Thanksgiving 2008. But in May 2008, a few months earlier, that should have been a wake-up call to intelligence agencies, most of all the Indians, when Hafiz Mohammed Said, the head of the LET, declared his clarion call to exterminate crusaders, Hindus, and Jews. That goes to show that the LET was deciding to go international, which of course they did, and it has been so ever since. So Kashmir is the least of it, which of course is also put out in certain apologist quarters as a reason for the LET's attacks or other attacks in India. The LET now has a beachhead in Afghanistan and is in cahoots with organizations there too. We know there are LET sleeper cells in Germany, France, and Australia. And it remains to be seen if the Pakistani deep state can rein them in, which it is not likely given their ideological compulsions, which are hardline and may not necessarily be modified to suit Pakistani pragmatism and expediency as cynically pursued by the establishment as and when it chooses to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wagmar, for your insightful analysis. Very warm welcome to you, Dr. Stott. I would like to invite you for your opening remarks, and also, if I may take the liberty to just ask in a quick question, is what was your observations on Hafiz Saeed on his visits to England, UK? Because I think you have done a lot of research on the British jihadi aspect as well. Thank you very much, sir.
Indeed. Well, let's just get that issue out of the way first of all. Hafiz Saeed was a visitor to the UK in the 1990s, and the BBC did some excellent digging through the history of his speaking tour in 1995. And what we find really is somebody who is in his element overseas, propagating his message, moving around between large crowds at a series of mosques in pretty much in a succession of British cities, and even appearing outside of his particular sectarian affiliation. He spoke at a Deobandi mosque in Glasgow. He spoke to university students in Leicester. And the message given by Hafiz Saeed was one that was beginning to bubble up rather in the early 1990s among British Islamists, which was this incredible sense of grievance. First of all, agitating around the Kashmir question, but also secondly around Bosnia and the Palestinian question as well. And young British Muslims were asked to do their duty and to rally, if you like, for the cause in those theatres. So to travel to Bosnia, to travel to Kashmir, and certainly in their hundreds, people did. And in many ways, this is the origin of the attacks that we were subsequently to see, for example, 7/7, where 2 of the 4 attackers had travelled to Pakistan shortly before the attacks. So people like Hafiz Saeed, they do not just have an impact in Pakistan, they do not just have an impact in India, they have an impact internationally. And I think sometimes in the West, we're not always very good at recognizing that international impact of terrorism. We focus much more on events on our own doorstep, which is perhaps natural, but we can't evade, I'm afraid, what happens in other parts of the world. Now, just to take things back a step in terms of recognizing the victims of 26/11, I want to just draw people's attention to this very good book called The Siege, which was written by a couple of British journalists, Cathy Scott Clark and Adrian Levy. But that's probably the best book I've seen in terms of interviewing witnesses, in following the attacks minute by minute, if you like, and also in terms of recognizing Pakistani culpability. This was state-sponsored and state-directed terrorism, and that needs to be central to any discussion about the Mumbai attacks. I think the tactics that we saw that day, though they'd been used in Kashmir previously, the sort of the entry from a foreign country, the roving groups of attackers, taking of hostages, torture of hostages, unfortunately, as well. All of those are elements, are tactics which we've seen subsequently in jihadist attacks in Europe. So if you look, for example, at the Paris attacks in 2015, we see people entering into France either via Belgium or people coming up through the immigration routes to the south of Europe. And that's a difficult thing for the authorities to deal with because, of course, often their focus is on extremists in situ, people who they may have been watching for many months or years, but here are people entering a country, carrying out an attack virtually immediately. And we saw that again in the attack on the Notre Dame in Nice just recently, somebody who'd come into the country via Italy from Tunisia, just a very short period before. The impact and the reason I think why Pakistan looks to use these tactics, and it's worth stressing we've seen it continue as recently as 2019 in the Pulwama bombing, but the targeting in Mumbai of iconic sites, the targeting of areas where tourists would be, the deliberate picking out of, I think, probably the only Jewish community centre in Mumbai, all of that tells us a lot about the mindset here. And this desire, which you see in the big terrorist spectaculars, to strike out at the other, for want of a better word. And that is obviously how Westerners are seen within parts of the Pakistani military establishment and in the minds of the jihadist groups, but it's also how Jews are seen. And India, if you like, is the eternal enemy. And in the West, we need to recognize that core element in the Pakistani mindset that, yes, there may be temporary alliances, temporary work done against groups like Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, but the enemy for Pakistan remains India. And we're not realizing who we deal with, who we're working with, unless we understand that. And I'll leave it there for the moment, so as not to hog the discussion. I'm sure you've got points of your own to make, and Berzine will as well.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dr. Scott. Very, very wonderfully analyzed. Much appreciated. I've got a few observations of my own, which I would like to place in front of the honorable panel. It's from the political side. Like, if you follow the chronology, as per my understanding, within months of the attack, the Pakistani Interior Minister Rahman Malik, he made an open disclosure saying that the attackers actually left the Pakistani soil of Tata in Sindh province. After that, that's the Arabian Sea. So this is a cabinet level minister, making a submission. Okay, so then we go forward. Then after that, there is this institute in Pakistan, which is the NI, the National Investigative Agency, the equivalent to the CBI, like the domestic in India. And its Director General, Mr. Khosa, in the Khosa inquiry, he has, categorically confessed to the fact that all the attackers were from the Punjab province of Pakistan. So these Pakistani, high-placed ranking officials who are admitting to the fact that the identity and the planning and the everything of the Mumbai carnage took place in Pakistani soil. And this is not any disputed territory we are talking about, because in the Khosa review, it has been categorically said that the control room was in Karachi itself. So we are not talking anything, apart from the when they say this is like non-state actors, I would go ahead one step to say yes, but on the direction of the deep state directors. Secondly, if you follow the chronology, in 2018, the ex-prime minister of Pakistan, Nawaz Sharif, in an explicit interview, has confirmed, and he has asked questions on the military establishment as to why we are allowing, people from Pakistan to go over to Mumbai and carry out the attack. So this is a former, like a prime minister of Pakistan, who is admitting to the fact. And same goes with another cabinet level minister who has been quoted saying that we need to put our house in order. And then the question is, which house is it? Is it the house of Rawalpindi or the house of Islamabad? What is the address of that house? We don't know that. Well, I can only speculate. But my argument will be that obviously there is a deep ridge in the Pakistani state, as you may say, and the deep state, and which I think Nawaz Sharif has recently even gone a step further to say it is a state within the state or above the state. They call all the shots, and it is their ever perpetual hate towards the two-nation theory where it all stems from. And I would also like you to give your comments on the 1993 Mumbai attacks, where a series of coordinated, bomb blasts took place in the Indian financial capital, and which was, again, if you analyze the back end, the training, the material, everything was sponsored by the deep state. So probably my discussion points will be based on this. I would come to Mr. Wagmar first for your observations and your comments on what you want to add to that, please. Thank you.
Yeah. In January 2009, Mr. Dev Sarkar, Rahman Malik, as Interior Minister, had a conference in the early days of January, early to mid-Jan, if I recollect. This was sometime in the afternoon as he conducted the press conference. And at one point, he did say, to Mr. Malik's credit, he pointed out that, yes, from what we have gleaned of the dossier, some part of it was hatched in Pakistan. And that is all what Mr. Malik said in very sober, judicious fashion, and left it at that, because this was barely just 2 months after the incident. A sitting minister of the Home Ministry, Interior Ministry, as they call it in the federal scheme of things in Pakistan, stated so. By that evening, Yusuf Raza Gilani, Prime Minister, was upbraiding him that he had no business to conduct press conferences and make irresponsible remarks publicly. Now, I don't see why a Home Minister would make irresponsible remarks in the first instance, or just talk out of his hat, which clearly Mr. Malik was not doing. So that was the first giveaway in January 2009. Can we just back up to the previous year, December 2008, a month on after Bombay, before Christmas 2008, Director General Shuja Pasha of the ISI flew into Washington to Langley, Virginia, to see his counterpart, General Michael Hayden, and make a clean breast and, quite frankly, fib about the entire incident, when he stated it had nothing to do with me or my agency or any so-called rogue elements within, and that I plead ignorance and innocence at the same time. We do know that is plainly not true because of what David Coleman Headley has mentioned in his Chicago trial to the FBI and also to the Indians who had subsequent access to him through the National Investigative Agency, that the Americans finally relented and permitted them to come on board and to field queries to him. But even putting that aside, we also now do know from other sources that a few days after Bombay 26/11, Lieutenant General Shuja Pasha had a one-off meeting with P5 ambassadors in Islamabad, that is the Permanent Security Council members. And therein he did acknowledge to them privately that it was a rogue operation of some elements within the ISI. This has not come out in the public domain and is not up for public consumption, but is only known within select circles and academic circles at that, and of course intelligence circles and political circles, diplomatic circles of the said countries, the 5 members of the UN Security Council. But of course, they would not make it publicly known. Why did Pasha acknowledge this to them? Escapes me personally. But the fact is that he did go on record to state so. But then he had another interview with Der Spiegel, Germany's leading monthly magazine. And there, of course, he denied any of this. So, of course, this Janus-faced attitude of Pakistan is not something new as we know it. You brought up Bombay, March 1993, the attacks which occurred after the December 92 mosque demolition. And that was, of course, seen as an element which was it was an unholy nexus of several elements. Primarily the Muslim underworld, which of course operates and subvents the Indian Bollywood film industry of Bombay. But there were also other nefarious elements who wanted to exploit what had occurred with the riots in Bombay in January 1993. Note that after the mosque demolition, which took place in December 92, Bombay did not personally, Mr. Debsakar, undergo the havoc which occurred across North India. There were some skirmishes in the city, in the metropolitan area of the city, but Bombay still maintained and held its own. It was the second spate of violence that occurred after the New Year in January 93 that was more deadly. And that led to tensions across the city and looting and pillage and lumpen elements from all sides joining the fray as to what happened. So we were given to understand that March 93 attacks at the Bombay Stock Exchange, which is Asia's oldest stock exchange, as you know, since 1885, and other sites, including the Goldsmiths Bazaar and elsewhere, were targeted attacks which took place in the afternoon. It was a Friday, and it was done primarily against Hindus. And instantly, when I did mention about, which is why I brought up Bombay Airport, that the airport was a target for 2611, but was dropped. But in March 93, one grenade was lobbed onto the tarmac area in Bombay, near sitting Air India aircraft, but nothing did occur then. But Bombay Airport was attacked in March 93. And the accomplices and the modus operandi of the entire operation was conducted with connivance of the Pakistani deep state. And of course, Dawood Ibrahim as the warlord, the gang lord in question, has been domiciled in Karachi ever since. And nothing precious little has come out of it because Pakistan consistently denies of his existence. What I was last given to understand is that he's had a facial restructuring done to conceal his identity, which may not be entirely unlikely. Since his move from Dubai to Karachi, where of course he is now permanently domiciled, and I dare say now even a Pakistani honorary citizen at that. And finally, to point out this against Paul Stott's remarks, what one FBI official stated after Bombay, Paul, was this: Bombay changed everything. And it truly has, because even Western intelligence agencies were left perplexed after the incident as to what if it happened on our doorsteps. Take any American small to medium-sized, say, Midwestern city, which would be attacked like this. I mean, just where do we even begin with tackling this in the first few hours of such a crisis, God forbid. This is what the FBI stated on record, and is even pointed out by Christine Fair in her Senate subcommittee report on Bombay, which is a very exhaustive study, one among several, besides that of Scott Clark and Levy. And of course, Stephen Tankel, Paul, your corresponding colleague in DC, who wrote up a very important monograph, quite abstractly titled Storming the World Stage. For the LET incident. And that is what has happened, as I mentioned, with the LET having gone international and targeting, as we know, Hindus and Jews explicitly, and crusaders, by which it denotes Western infidels, whites at that. And that this is something for the Pakistani deep state to consider. Because now the LET, as we know it, has shifted gears into Afghanistan. And it is working in tandem with Sunni militant groups there who are completely untethered, absolute loose cannons, who incidentally are not funded, not under the direction of the ISI, the said Sunni groups I'm referring to in question. The ISI would simply put its hands up and say, we have nothing to do with these groups. And of course, it can't control them because it can't. But would the LET be able to prevail upon such groups as fellow brother Muslims in moderating their stance? I doubt it, because the LET's stance itself is one of a hardline, austere view, an uncompromising view, as you see it in their newsletter too, on the question of Kashmir. They are against any such Kashmir dialogue with India, or between India and Pakistan for that matter too. And finally, Benazir Bhutto's revealing interview sometime around May 2000 also provides another disturbing insight into what occurred. This refers to her first stint as Prime Minister between 88 and 90. And she mentions that the ISI made it clear to her that they wanted the LET to dictate Pakistan's Kashmir policy, not the Pakistan Foreign Office, and they wanted to weed away the all parties Hurriyat conference in India's Jammu and Kashmir away from the Kashmir question and have the LET call the shots, along with the Jaish-e-Mohammed group and the Harkatul Ansar, which of course, as we know, has come to stay and is very much a part of the scene even now with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wagmar. I would like to open the conversation to Dr. Stott for his remarks, please.
Yes, I think it's important to take a step back and focus on why terrorism is such a useful tool for both groups and for nation states. And the Mumbai attacks really are a classic example of unfortunately the value for money that terrorism brings. Berzine touched on the scale of the disruption to Mumbai from just 10 people, and the financial cost to the Pakistani state and to the Lashkar-e-Tayyiba group is minimal. Also, you've in effect humbled the Indian state as they were seeing it at the time and talking about it, when in a straight military fight between India and Pakistan, Pakistan would almost certainly lose. So you can see the motivations for these types of incidents and why they are likely to occur and reoccur rather than being eliminated. We also have to look at internal motivations within Pakistan, which is a country, I think, greatly divided in terms of class, in terms of wealth, that suffers from its own regional divisions and its own separatist and nationalist movements, which we're often very poorly informed of here in the West, which we hear very little about, other than the persistence of some diaspora groups, such as the Kashmiris in particular. In the UK, an entirely different message tends to come out both from the Pakistani government and from some of the big Muslim representative groups, for example. But there's a particular problem for Pakistan in terms of how you unite such a disparate country. And of course, in a majority Muslim, overwhelmingly Muslim country, Islam or some form of message based around the religion is always likely to be that unifying tool. And of course, that is a problem potentially. And if you look recently at the enormous crowds attending the funeral of the Barelvi leader, Kadim Rizvi, somebody who'd put hundreds of thousands of people on the streets in big demonstrations against apostasy that would nearly always be followed with violence, with the targeting of minorities, be they Hindus, Christians, or the tiny Sikh population in India. Giving ground to such actors appears to be part of the method that's used to keep the nation state together, to keep some degree of unity for the country. And that's worrying going forward, because once you're trapped in that mechanism, there's always the risk of the tail wagging the dog. And that's what we saw on 26/11, and I'm afraid that's probably what we're likely to see again in the future.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stott. I would just like to quickly check with Mr. Director of Bridge India to see if we have any Q&A, like any impending questions which have come from any of our members who are watching us.
Mr. Deb Sarkar, there is an instructive question I've just read. Perhaps I could respond to that presently, as to why did India not avenge Bombay 26/11 and to set right the carnage, as it were. Well, this was discussed by the Cabinet Office in New Delhi. under Prime Minister Singh at that time. We do know now that about this from a recent publication. Pakistani Foreign Secretary Kasuri's memoirs were published by Oxford University Press in the recent past. And Mr. Kasuri gives us to understand this, that apparently the late Richard Holbrooke, AFPAC man, as we know, from the Obama administration, was making shuttle diplomacy visits between both capitals. And it's given to understand, this is how Mr. Holbrooke put it, and this is how Mr. Kasuri reports and publishes the version to us for public consumption, that on his visit to Islamabad, Richard Holbrooke queried, what would happen if India were to conduct limited surgical airstrikes with Muridke, the LET headquarters, in mind? Kasuri first was a bit apoplectic, but then said we would not take it lying down and it would be avenged. Now, the question is whether it would spiral out of control is another matter, because Indian planners have decided moving forward that they are going to work under the shadow of a nuclear threat from Pakistan, since Pakistan simply can't just get away with that as bogeyman, as it were. But the point is, the Pakistanis and Kasuri himself stated that we knew the question was fielded to us by Mr. Holbrooke, but it would not have occurred to him, given the fact that he had just arrived from New Delhi, and this was what he was putting out were New Delhi's tacit feelers to us. What would happen? And clearly that the question had come from New Delhi. And of course, this was, as I just mentioned, Mr. Kasuri's response. But the question is also this, what happened, or rather what did not happen, is that from what I'm given to understand, Indian Air Force Chief at that time, Fali Major, did say he was ready to go in, provided up to the minute intelligence information was available. I'm given now to understand that this was not possible for a variety of reasons, that the Indians did have a lot of information, and most of it would have been in all probability accurate, but it was not copper-bottomed. It was not completely verifiable for them to take the final plunge and undertake surgical strikes. There were some gaps in Indian intel, if you must put it that way. And that is why Prime Minister Singh was reticent to undertake such surgical strikes. So there was a intelligence dearth on the part of the Indians, not to mention intelligence lapses, which of course led to what happened in Bombay 26/11 too. So that perhaps should answer to certain Indian queries as to why it was not, why no retaliation took place from the Indian state. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have got two questions which are for all of us, basically. The first one is from Dr. Gautam Chakrabarti. He's saying, he thanks us, especially Mr. Wagmar, for his analysis and his the points which he has made. His particular point is from the point about Pakistan forces whisking away Kasab's parents and gagging the villagers, wasn't aware of this. So was the Pakistani establishment aware of this? Probably that's one. And there's a second question to all the panelists, which is from Mr. Sriju. He's one of our members at Bridge India as well. Like, the question goes, is it too late now to inflict punishment on those in the Pakistani establishment responsible for two major carnages in the past, namely those of 2003 and 2008? And there is one question specific to Mr. Wagmar, which is from Chris Matthews. He thanks you for your comments, and then he asks you, how can some of this disinformation in Kashmir can be tackled in its full capacity? Thank you very much. So maybe Dr. Scott, if you want to address a few of.
Yes, please. I think in terms of responding to these outrages, it's worth stressing that we did see a response after the Pulwama bombing in Kashmir in 2019. And we saw the Indian Air Force in action. So there has been a response at the military level. I think where India has enjoyed success has actually been at the diplomatic level, in that globally the association between Pakistan and terrorism, one of the reasons it's so strong is because of events such as Mumbai. And also, I think, disastrously at the international level, the discovery of bin Laden in Abbottabad, a Pakistani garrison town, which really cemented the reputation of Pakistan in the United States. So what we've seen at the diplomatic level is the Financial Action Task Force putting Pakistan on its grey list, one step away from the blacklist, and that has really limited Pakistan's access to debt relief, to getting loans, to getting cash. It's seen as a country that's soft on money laundering, that's got a major problem with terrorist financing, and that is likely to continue for the near future. And it's weakened the hand that Imran Khan has to play. And I think that's why we saw China accepting the addition of the Army of Mohammed, the JEM's Masood Azhar, on the UN sanctions list, for example, something that China had wriggled about and had dithered and delayed and trying to support Pakistan on for as long as it could. And then really there was just no more wriggle room for them. And in the diplomatic arena, it's one of the reasons, I think, why we hear comparatively little from Imran Khan, apart from, of course, these attempts to sort of rally the base with these. There was the intervention recently criticizing President Macron and complaining about Facebook. All of that really is designed to rally his base. It isn't a message that's taken in any way seriously at the international level, where he knows, unfortunately, he has to take a much more passive approach.
Thank you very much.
To the query by Mr.
Please.
Matthews of why can't we combat disinformation on Kashmir, that is entirely relevant to query aloud. And I would respond to it like this. Well, what happens in Kashmir and Palestine is a question of hypocrisy. What we do see here are selective Muslim outrages and double standards at play. Given that in Balochistan, things are far and away worse, not to mention Xinjiang, where Uyghur Muslims are force-fed pork, and in concentration camps reminiscent of the 30s in Europe. But Pakistan will not make a pipsqueak against the PRC on that. And Pakistan will have nothing to say about Balochistan and consider it an internal matter. Just as the Turks and the Iraqis and Syrians consider the Kurdish question a closed internal matter. Namely, Muslims are permitted to visit atrocities upon fellow Muslims, and that is an internal question which oughtn't concern non-Muslims. Now, the question of Kashmir with India or Palestine with Israel, what brings into sharper relief the focus is of non-Muslims wielding the whip over supposedly beleaguered Muslims. Given living standards in Palestine and Kashmir, you can just imagine how Baluchis, not to mention Uyghurs, would wince and see that they actually live far and away better than one would imagine so-called Muslims as victims. But this confection of lies, exaggerated hypocrisy, and mendacity that is put out by certain Muslim apologist elements must be combated. And remember, in the final scheme of things, I would like to put this to all your viewers is this. India and Israel come in for greater criticism because they are open, transparent, democratic societies where accountability is a way of life, where vigilance is the price one pays for liberty and democracy 24/7, where you have a voluble press, where you have civil society mechanisms and organizations in place to hold to account the leadership for infractions, omissions, and commissions. None of this happens with Pakistan or in Turkey with the Kurdish question. And so the bar is lowered for Muslims time and time again. That is why it's convenient for Muslims to concentrate on, say, Kashmir or Palestine and not just dilate but exaggerate views on it. Given that what happens in the Muslim world when Muslims are targets and victims of Muslim persecution goes unheeded or is consistently and conveniently shoved under the carpet. So there is hypocrisy at play here within liberal leftist circles, metropolitan circles, also within academia, as Paul and I would only too well know about it. That somehow, and this is also hypocritical, and it smacks of absolute revulsion that the so-called Westerners would lower the bar for Muslims who inflict atrocities on Muslims. So are those Muslim victims lesser individuals? Why would you not hold Muslims to accountability and be as stern with them as you would be for, say, with India or Israel? And for that matter, Paul, one also notices that China is not let off the hook. There is consistent criticism of the Chinese too, on a host of issues. But for somehow when it comes to the Muslim world, exceptionalism kicks in and we need to lower the bar, as if there are some special circumstances involved. If anything, I would imagine thinking intelligent Muslims would consider it insulting that a patronizing white Western world wishes to demean them and somehow exculpate them for their omissions or commissions. And to the question from Berlin about Pakistani reluctance and the British scenario, perhaps I'll leave that to Paul Stott to combat, because the individual asks, is British civil society, Her Majesty's government opinion, more warm to the need of engaging actively against Pak-sponsored terrorism? Paul, over to you on that.
Okay, thank you to Dr. Chakrabarti for the question, which I see there on the screen. I think at times the British government has been robust. So in 2009, we had the visit of Gordon Brown, who was then Prime Minister, and I think Gilani was the leader of Pakistan. And by that stage, the number of terrorist plots and the whole sort of post 7/7 series of investigations had made the point quite clear to the British that the biggest threat to Britain, certainly in terms of terrorism, was from Pakistan. And Gordon Brown was absolutely explicit to the Pakistani authorities about that problem. So we were, we were laying it on the line. The reality, though, is that things will only change with regards to Pakistan when two things happen. One is we cut off the flow of money from Britain to Pakistan, and two, we end the status of London as the sort of bolt hole for the rich and those who wish to hide away. There is the potential of progress in those two areas. In 2013 and in 2017, the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Houses of Parliament raised concerns about the scale of British financial support for Pakistan, and that the majority or large amounts of that money were in effect being wasted, were being lost in corruption, weren't going to help those who were actually needy. We've also seen a clampdown on London as this sort of bolt hole for those of dubious means. So, for example, our National Crime Agency was responsible for confiscating what I think was the most expensive house in London, and that was owned by the Pakistani businessman behind the Bracktown company. And he actually reached an out-of-court agreement whereby he lost this house that I think was valued as over 100 million or something. So only really when Pakistan's elite is inconvenienced and when the taps are turned off in terms of the money, I suspect will we really be making rapid progress here.
I just want to probably just continue with Paul's comments on and Mr. Wagner's on Kashmir. Recently, we have seen the developments in the House of Lords on the Kashmiri front and advocate, promoting hatred and armed struggle against India. So we are seeing changes on the ground. And just to answer to Dr. Chakrabarty's earlier comment on Ajmal Kasab's family, it was like widely reported in Pakistani media. And if you go to Twitter or any other social media platform, there's this very notable gentleman, Mr. Najam Sethi. He used to be even the PCB, the Pakistani Cricket Board's chairman. His wife has posted videos of the parents of Kasab being interviewed, and they're all available. So there's no hiding of the fact that that chap's parents and his relatives were in Punjab, and they were rightly identified, and then the deep state clamped on and put a total media blanket on it. So we don't know anything further, but those are out there for you if you wish to have a quick look. There is one further corresponding question which I think Paul has probably partly answered. It's from Dr. Michael. He's saying that he's rightly pointing out your comment on the diplomatic level success, but he's also probably questioning the moves as more like an election or a PR stunt purposes for the domestic consumption. What would you like to say, Paul?
Well, I think we have to contrast the sort of the bottom-up street-level campaigning that's often carried out on the Kashmir question by supporters of Pakistan in countries like the UK and indeed in other countries. That there perhaps hasn't been much similar from the Indian diaspora, or the Indian government probably prefers to conduct its diplomatic business at the diplomatic level rather than the street level. So on one level, that's to be admired. I mean, you mentioned the House of Lords a little earlier. One of the players in the agitation around Kashmir was Lord Ahmed of Rotherham, who had a very high profile for some years, firstly as a Labour peer. He was then disgraced amid accusations of anti-Semitism. He spent a short time in prison after a driving offence. Remarkably, after being in prison, was able to return to the House of Lords and has recently resigned from his seat in the House of Lords when it was expected the House of Lords would vote for his expulsion. There's a report on the House of Lords website which people can read, and I would also add that he faces some unpleasant charges in Rotherham in court in the new year as well. So I think perhaps a period of silence from him is probably now the best route.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think we're coming to a close now. So, Mr. Wagmar, in probably a minute, your closing remarks, please, and then followed by Paul, please. Thank you.
Yes, the costs must become prohibitive for Pakistan. A variety of diplomatic measures ought to be implemented by India. And in anticipation of Pakistani detractors who would point out that what is happening in Kashmir is just payback for Balochistan and an insurgency that has been racking there, let me point out as a historian that questions of accession are not exclusive just to Kashmir since 1947, but also concern Balochistan since March 1948. And the Balochis are ambivalent about being Pakistani. And as we do know now from the recent memoir of a former Pakistani intelligence agent, chief rather, Mr. Asad Durrani, according to him, India plays a minimal, if absolute absent role in the Baloch insurgency, which is completely local and stems from domestic discontent. So that Pakistani contention that India is stoking fires in Balochistan goes out of the window, given that a former Director General of the ISI has stated so in print. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wagmar. Your floor, please, Dr. Scott.
Yes, I think I would just like to close things on from my side, really, by recognizing the scale of the crime which occurred in Mumbai in 2008, and unfortunately giving a slightly negative message that such attacks are likely to occur again in the future. India is making enormous progress as a multi-racial, multi-religious democracy. It deserves the support of the West in that journey. That does mean that it has enemies, and that's likely to continue. I would commend India on the progress made at the diplomatic level on these issues, and really stress the importance of the financial action task force following the money trail, and that countries like Britain need to stand by our Indian friends and work together on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really thank all the panelists and Bridge India for hosting such a wonderful webinar, remembering the victims of the Mumbai terror carnage. We all know terrorism is a virus, and it spreads indiscriminately. It doesn't have any bearing whatsoever on religion, region, or whatever is your belief. So we have to have a joint voice in order to condemn and to confront all these activities. So I think we should be firm in our resolve, and we would like to have more insightful discussions with Bridge India, hopefully in the future. Thank you very much, Mr. Dadani, for organizing this. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.